I must confess at the outset that I've been a huge admirer of CSE from the first State of India's Environment Report and the second one. And so it's quite likely that because of this admiration over more than 3 decades, I'm likely to lay a lot of expectations, at your doorstep. And so in some sense, some of them could be unrealistic, but it's just simply a function of the fact that I think there's practically very little that you can't do. And I want to start off by explaining why I feel these two are, the first question around best practices and next practices is important. We're spending far too much time on, we're constantly responding to situations. And as a sector, we don't seem to be able to get ahead of the game at all. And so we're still trying to respond to crises as they emerge. We then document them. We call them best practices. We're just not able to get ahead. And in some sense, how do you find the right balance between focusing on what works now and what ought to work in the future? The second is this whole question of scale. And I would imagine that particularly for an organization like Center for Science Environment, School of Waste and Water, the expectation is that in some sense, training is a pathway to scale. But is there more that can be done? Because at the end of the day, scale does matter in India more than ever before, more than anywhere else. And so in some sense, I think we have to use these two lenses to question where we're going, which is that are we still only trying to respond to crises that exist today? Or are we taking steps today that could potentially avert crises of the future or help us get onto a new path? And the second is, how do we try and address some of these questions? A lot of what I'm going to share, particularly for this audience, is unlikely to be new. I'm going to focus a little bit on rural as well, and not just urban. And it's neither as well structured as Dhruv's presentation, and it's going to range from micro level program problems that we are encountering to policy level issues that we have confronted with. And one recurring theme through all of this is the question of how do we change behaviors? Whether it is to generate demand for services or new, or changing aspirations. But in some sense, this whole question of changing behaviors is an important task, which particularly organizations like CSE and Down to Earth can have a significant role to play. And so changing behaviors and demand is a sort of recurrent theme. I'll quickly try and just run through some thoughts about this. And, when I'm starting to look at emerging priorities from a rural context, I first wanted to talk about where we are seeing very clear geographical gaps. Himalayan states, not surprising. Northeastern states, not surprising. Punjab, Haryana, Kerala are huge gaps. Haryana's got a massive problem with wastewater, management. There's accumulation of wastewater is fairly widespread. Water bodies, traditional water bodies, are largely contaminated and polluted. There's very little work at trying to address this. Punjab's got a huge, there are significant parts of Punjab with a significant water quality issue. Now, the days when the existence of uranium contamination in groundwater would be talked in hushed tones are days of the past. Now we are seeing widespread availability and data on the extent of uranium contamination of groundwater in Punjab. And there's very little that's happening in these two states, for example. And similarly, Kerala, where Kerala, the difference between urban and rural practically doesn't exist. You also have areas of high water table. You have poor sanitation systems, the risks of groundwater contamination, flooding of leach pit toilets, inability to manage fecal waste all exist. So I think it's important for us to recognize that in addition to Himalayan states, the northeastern states, we're also seeing other parts where there are significant gaps. We're seeing a demand even within government for support. and very little in terms of civil society action to be able to match this and respond to that. That's one. The second, in a rural context, we see a lot of work happening in either very small scattered habitations, particularly, a population less than, say, looking at 200 households or less. And then you start to see government now paying attention to larger, what used to, which are census towns, so 5,000 population and above. And there's this gap of medium-sized villages, 1,500 to 5,000 population, which are by and large now seem to be falling through the cracks because no one's focusing adequately in these villages in large enough numbers. So that's one set of, which is that there are gaps in terms of geography. Now in terms of rural sanitation, I'm going to split this into 3 or 4: solid waste and then liquid waste primarily. But within liquid waste, look at both grey water and fecal. Solid waste management, so one is that biodegradable waste, everywhere you're hearing people say that at the household level. So on the one hand, there are parts of the country where people have always managed their biodegradable waste on their own. Manure, they've always managed to look at some treating it, using it as compost, converting it, using vermicompost, and then applying it in their fields. At a community level, there seems to be this large belief that is being propagated that, if you can take biodegradable waste, convert it into a host of organic products, everything ranging from organic manure to growth promoters, then there's going to be a market for this. And there is now, with emergence of self-help groups, a rural livelihood mission, there is this belief that all that you need to do is to convert biodegradable waste into all of these products. And there is this latent market just waiting there for you to provide these products. We have no evidence that this works. And it works at that there's enough demand for it, or there is even the scale that there. So beyond household level treatment, this community level effort at looking at conversion of biodegradable waste into products doesn't seem to be working at all. And it seems like we're falling into this trap of believing that there is a market, and then communities are going to be left left in the lurch with all of these products and no market for it. There's now a revival in some sense of biogas. And I didn't think I'd see this. And biogas is coming back in a massive scale. And it's not because of Govardhan scheme of SBM. It's actually happening because of something called SATAT, which is the Ministry of Renewable Energy Resources has got this new thing about converting waste to energy. And there is an incentive scheme there, and that suddenly lead to a massive offtake in suddenly efforts of converting biodegradable waste, both manure as well as biomass, into fuel. So we're seeing a revival of biogas in a scale that I haven't seen before. But a lot of these are driven by enterprises. This is not community level panchayats setting up their own biogas plant to meet their electrification needs of their village. These are now enterprises coming in, setting up on scale, and offering to do all of this at a cost. But there's a massive sort of spurt that we are seeing in the recent past on this waste to energy bit. But I don't think we know enough about what's happening. It seems as there's a lag between the fact that this is growing at a rapid pace and our ability to add value to it, or to then look at how is it that this can be expanded. With regard to non-biodegradable waste, government is promoting recovery centers on a large scale. But again, there's very little known about the economics of this. Does it make sense to do it at a panchayat level? Should every panchayat be setting up its own waste recovery center? What is the scale? Is there a quantum of solid waste based on which you should take a decision on whether it makes sense at all or not? Or are we better off just allowing panchayats to segregate the waste and allow the informal market that exists of the kabadiwalas coming, picking it up and taking it away? Or why, so there's this tussle between government pushing recovery centers, waste management centers, and just simply recognizing that scale is important here. This is not going to happen everywhere. And why don't we just allow for segregation to happen and let the informal or the formal network which deals with this just take it over instead of trying to manage every aspect of this waste supply chain. Sanitary waste remains an issue where is not being dealt with. Urban areas are grappling with it, but in a rural context, this is not as small a problem as we thought it was. It is a fairly significant problem and a growing problem. And so there's a need to sort of recognize this as well. We as an institution not looked at solid waste at all. And the reason why we're now starting to look at solid waste is simply because we can't deal with liquid waste without addressing this issue. This is clogging everything. If you've got an existing conveyance system in the village, which is invested off by the government, those drains are getting clogged. If you've got a natural drainage system, solid waste is clogging all of that. And so at some point, we reach that point where we feel that we can't deal with the issue of liquid waste without addressing this question, even in a rural context, because the quantums of waste are becoming just far too large. So liquid waste management, I will start off with just some sort of common themes which cut across both gray and black water. The first is that, there needs to be a reaffirmation of the fact that we should be looking at decentralized solutions in a rural context and try and treat this as close to the source as possible. If we don't constantly reinforce this, there is a tendency for government and then the political economy of all of this taking over and investing in large engineering structures. From a pure political economy perspective, it is always going to be more attractive to set up complex centralized treatment systems rather than to focus on decentralized systems that can manage this at waste, at source. And so in some sense, we've got to decide on what is going to be the focus and how do we get this message across. Low cost, both in terms of capital expenditure, operations, ease of maintenance, low energy, will need to be some of the criteria which we take these decisions about what kind of liquid waste management solutions we want. There's now a large push coming from companies which are offering products for liquid waste management. But do we want to focus on processes that are open source, where you can actually have this being done at a community level with some minimal support? Or do we want to get into this trap where we're going to say, we don't want to deal with tested methods that are open source, which are processes that are known, and wait for this magical product to arrive where the company is going to come set it up for you, and then you're going to struggle with operation maintenance 3 years down the line. And today, government's increasingly moving towards acquiring some of these magical products that are being offered, which will handle everything. There's a need to have a matrix of choices, both by ecology, by terrain, as well as by population density, because the nature of habitations also in some sense will determine the choices that we make with regard to liquid waste management solutions. And there's a need to provide assistance, guidance, both in terms of decision-making around site selection and assessment. One of the problems that we are fearing is that a large number of these liquid waste management solutions, which are centralized, might actually be over-engineered. Their ability to get an assessment done of the capacity that they need to solve for is not there. And so there's a need for helping build capacity in better site selection as well as an assessment. Do we want to, we're seeing this massive gap between availability of information and absorption of this. If you were to try and search for information available on liquid waste management solutions, there's a host of manuals and guidelines available. The Department of Drinking Water and Sanitation has its own guidelines on grey water management, are fairly comprehensive. But there's a lot of information available. And yet, at a state government level or at a district level or a block level, despite the existence of all of this information, there seems to be a very limited absorption of this and a willingness to try it out. And because of this, we're seeing increasingly large centralized solutions being driven in rural contexts. Very few states are having the courage to look at decentralized household level treatment rather than centralized treatment. Testing is a massive constraint, both of all kinds of liquid waste. And in the absence of not being able to test this as well, we also have very poor evidence with regard to performance of how each of these systems actually perform. And in some sense, given the fact that CSE has access to a lab, if there's a way to actually make this, to look at expanding or democratize access to this testing, it might make a difference. Now, I'll quickly run through some of the others. So grey water, what's in today is waste stabilization ponds. Now, suddenly, this started off with Punjab, Haryana's picked this up, Madhya Pradesh following suit. Suddenly, everybody believes that the solution for grey water in this country is waste stabilization ponds. And these are now being promoted on massive scale. Yeah. Soak pits, leach pits, some states, Orissa, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka to a lesser extent, are still starting to invest in soak pits, leach pits. But there's a lot of questions emerging about do these contaminate water bodies? And in fact, we've just found access to one study which would actually looks at existence of soak pits, leach pits, and potential contamination of water body, of groundwater. So in some sense, if we want to promote decentralized solutions, we'll need better evidence of the fact that some of these are safe in certain ecologies and contexts. Not everywhere, but in some places that they're likely to work, under what conditions it might be useful. We're finding that in the absence of designing even soak pits, leach pits well, if you don't get your oil, grease, sand traps in place, your system collapses. And then you're blaming it on the decentralized system itself and throwing the baby out of the bathwater. And there again, there are innovations happening. So Meghalaya, for example, they've been using coconut husk as an absorbent in their sand traps, and they're feeling it absorbs grease, oil very well, and they're doing it. So there are innovations that are happening, but for simple errors in design, there's a risk that the entire solution will fall by the wayside. So we have household level, or you have centralized habitation level. We're not looking at cluster level solutions. 10 households, 15 households, 20 households, not the entire habitation, but where it is possible to look at an intermediate solution between a completely decentralized one and a centralized. There's just not enough work happening. Do we want to look at treating grey water in the drains, in situ? Or do we want to wait for it to land up in the water body, contaminate that, and then try and treat that? And this is now growing. As we see, with Jal Jeevan Mission being rolled out and with access to water improving, the quantum of wastewater being generated is increasing exponentially. And there again, there's a question where people, communities are grappling with this issue of, do you treat this? If you can't treat it at decentralized level, do you treat it in the drains itself, or do you wait for it to get to the water body and treat it? Revival of water bodies, and now there's this new Amrit. There was Jal Shakti Abhiyan, Catch the Rain. Now there's a new Amrit Sarovar scheme that's been rolled out. Every state is identifying within every district water bodies, traditional water bodies for revival. And at this point of time, a lot of it is limited to desiltation dredging. And there's a need to start to influence some of these programs as they're emerging. Because on scale, again, you're going to have the same problem where you're going to desilt all these water bodies and believe that you've solved the problem. But there's, again, how does one start to have an impact on reasonable scale? And there's very little work that's happened on recycling, reuse of water. That people are talking about grey water treatment is either going into natural recharge or being let out. But recycling, reuse, we're not seeing enough happen in a rural context on this. So like waste stabilization ponds are now sort of the buzz in grey water management, DWAT systems, DWATs-based FSTPs are seen as the panacea of all fecal waste in rural context. Again, decentralized small-scale solutions, trenches, gravel beds. For some reason, biodigesters have also just simply collapsed. There's no one seems to have. There was a large agency which raised questions about biodigesters, and that somehow led to biodigesters by and large getting killed. Strangely enough, with no evidence to suggest otherwise. So in some sense, decentralized small-scale solutions are just not working. And similarly, cluster-level solutions. Decision-making regarding sort of design of systems based on input characteristics of fecal waste is not happening. Because you've decided that you need DWATs-based FSTPs, you're not even looking at what's your input characteristics of your fecal waste. And so there's a risk that you end up having very complex systems where they might not even be required. which is adding to the cost, adding to the problems around maintenance. What do you do with treated sludge? What are the current practices? Are there gaps in this? Are there been trials on how this can be used? Is the future going to be to promote this as a growth promoter rather than as a fertilizer, which is prone to other kinds of policy regulation? It's something that we've got to find a way of, because we're going to end up with significant quantities of treated sludge and not know what to do with it. Innovations in desludging are going to be a huge challenge, even in rural areas, because there are areas where your existing desludging trucks cannot get in. And we're not seeing enough work in looking at innovative ways of being able to desludge in areas which can't be accessed by tanker-mounted or truck-mounted desludging vehicles. And the last challenge is around retrofitting of toilets. Because according to government's own admission, a third of toilets constructed under SBM are septic tanks. Now, a significant proportion of those are actually containment structures, or not even septic tanks. So the quantum of waste that we're talking about is fairly high. Then you have single pits in addition to that, where there's no likelihood of a second pit. So the quantum of waste is very high. So in some cases, we need to start looking at retrofitting of toilets if we want to address some of the fecal waste problems in rural areas as well. Quickly move to rural water. And I'm just going to talk about two issues which are sort of where we're struggling. There's a third, which is operation and maintenance, but I'm going to leave that out and just focus on two. One is source sustainability and the other is water quality. We need to start off by developing a wide understanding of groundwater and its importance. And the fact that it is invisible makes people believe it is inexhaustible. There is very little, I don't see how we're going to be able to solve for this on scale without getting people to understand the importance of groundwater. And someone or organizations need to work together to try and create this understanding, because in the absence of this, we're all going to be looking at supply side solutions. Now, similarly, within this, there's a lot of work happening on water conservation, recharge. This more drop per crop has failed. So this whole thing of water use efficiency in agriculture, we have no control over. There's very little happening there. And the question then is, how do we address the elephant in the room, which is a demand for groundwater? And so there is going to be a need to look at, so if at a minimum, can we look at, whether water security plans, whether the process of creating a water security plan and a water budget itself could lead to changes in behavior? Maybe that's something that we'll have to try and do it on a reasonable scale to see if this can change behaviors. The third is that rainwater harvesting, even in a rural context, is just not, we don't have the scale. It's where organizations are working, it's getting promoted, but again, better off families are able to do it. It's not widespread. So can we look at least institutions, public buildings, both decentralized storage and recharge? Revival of traditional water bodies I've talked about a little earlier. I'm surprised at the fact that it almost seems that the epitaph for watershed development has been written in this country. In the last 7, 8 years, there is just no conversation about this anywhere. No state government. And one wonders, is it that all of the efforts at watershed development had no impact at all? That suddenly just completely dropped off the radar. That you're talking about water conservation, but you're looking at water bodies, but suddenly watersheds are not there. In a limited area, you at least in the mountains, you're hearing about spring shed development. And there you have the valley to valley approach. But in other areas, none of the states that we're working in, are we seeing any efforts at looking at watersheds anymore and the conservation that can have? Because otherwise, it's very difficult to address, issues of water if on a landscape level, there are no treatments happening. It's all breaking down into one water body, one pond, one tank, recharge in this location. But we're not seeing evidence of any landscape level efforts at water conservation, recharge. Rural water, again, like on groundwater, there's no demand for water quality. People are still, they're going by, if it looks clear, there's no odor, the taste is all right, quality is fine. We're not able to generate demand for an understanding about the importance of water quality, and consequently, there's no demand for testing, right? Governments now decided as part of Jal Jeevan Mission to focus on ensuring that every district has one NABL accredited lab. And that's their focus. Primarily now, they're just focusing on getting one lab, NABL accredited lab per district. But where's the demand for those services? Who's taking these samples and going there? For an NABL accredited lab at district level, they have to, on an annual basis, their numbers are just appalling. They're looking at 3,000 samples in a year for an NABL accredited lab. That's it. That's the capacity of it. But there's no demand. Citizens are landing up there with their samples and saying, get it tested, because it doesn't matter. So I think there's a need to look at how do we start to generate this understanding on water quality, why it's important, and to generate demand for testing. There needs to be, matrix of choices on what's the quality and what are your choice of purification systems. And we need to popularize this so widely that you then don't have governments going in for just blindly ordering RO systems. So we're seeing one district has nitrate. It doesn't matter whether that village has a nitrate problem at all or not. The district is taking a call saying this is a treatment system for the entire district. So this happened with RO. We're now seeing it with other systems happening, where there is no link between actually the quality of water and the purification systems that are being purchased and deployed at scale. So we need to look at making this available or popularize this, saying, if this is your water quality problem, here are your choices. And let people also exert some pressure as a consequence of that. There's a tussle now taking place between household level purification systems. We have a large number of products available in the market. Many of them do it at a reasonable cost. And on the other hand, the struggle to try and make sure you get it right at a community level. And there's a trade-off. And at this point in time, it seems that the market will win by promoting household level purification systems at the cost of community level purification systems. And so there needs to be this whole effort to try and say, first, let's try and solve it at a community level. And those who can afford it are unhappy with that, then go ahead and buy their own. But we're losing the battle on community level treatment and allowing for household level purification systems to just proliferate. And this is finding its reflection. If you look at NSS 76 round, for the first time, I think in rural India, they found that 8.5% of the population was buying water. 8.5%, NSS 76 round, which was 3 years ago, was saying we're buying water. And we're seeing this growing everywhere. In areas with fluoride, in areas with salinity, we're seeing a proliferation of water. I mean, in Gaya, rural Gaya, I saw, little trucks coming and delivering dispensers with water, packaged water. And so this is sort of proliferated, and this is partially because of the fact that we've not been able to solve for community level purification. The last two issues, one is around saline ingress, and this is growing on a massive scale. And we also have a problem with nitrates. Both nitrates and saline ingress continue to sort of go. Now, if, for example, Odisha has a scheme called Mo Pokhri, where traditionally every household used to have its own pond in the back. And over a period of time, at a very large scale, these ponds have fallen by the wayside. No one's ever looked at studies to say whether having thousands of ponds exerting pressure actually kept saline ingress at bay. And in the fact that these ponds are now being degraded, is that leading to saline ingress? Because there are parts now of Odisha which didn't have salinity, which are reporting salinity. Same thing we're finding in parts of Vijayanagaram, Ramnathpuram. So there's an issue with saline ingress. Nitrates now are widespread. Where there's great agriculture, Malwa region in MP, because nitrates are now one of our biggest problems that we're encountering. The last is on field testing kits. There is no standards for field testing kits in this country. And in the absence of standards for field testing kits, even the quality of data that we manage to generate is very poor and unreliable. And so if CSE wishes to collaborate, we'd be happy to look at, looking at testing of field testing kits, and then maybe to work with BIS to say there need to be standards for field testing kits. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Quickly on urban water and sanitation, and there's just a couple of slides here. So one is at a policy level, I don't think we've got robust assessments of either the capacities in terms of skills and people, or on the financial health of public utilities. And if we don't start to look at this quickly, you're going to have PPPs now and BOT taking over. That suddenly government's going to wake up saying that this utility is in the red. They're going to then look at handing over parts of the utility to a private service provider and go to exit. And I think there's a need to quickly start to look at both assessing the skills that exist in these utilities. So everybody talks about 50% of drinking water requirement in urban areas being met by groundwater. Are 50% of the workforce in these utilities have any understanding of groundwater? The answer will be none. And so how do you then expect them to deal with issues around groundwater when they don't even have that capacity internally? Building codes now existed for a while. Been 6-7 years since changes in the building codes came, which require rainwater harvesting as well as wastewater treatment. But have we been able to popularize this? Do we need to look at incentives for wide-scale adoption of this? Now, basic services for low-income families in non-notified slums. There are some cities which take responsibility for provision of services. There are some cities which don't. And I think it's important for us to recognize how have some cities taken this decision to provide basic services, irrespective of legality of the settlement. And if some cities can do it, can we then look at what are the ways by which this has happened and make this widespread? Even in places like Bangalore, for example, I think if you live in a non-notified slum, the state has no responsibility for providing basic services. Lucknow, no responsibility. Orissa, Bhubaneswar has. Delhi has, Ahmedabad has. So we need to look at why this has happened in some places and look at how to popularize this. Equity in access, particularly for those beyond the pipe who are not access to pipe water networks. There's significant inequity in our cities. It's not just slums versus others. It is whether you have access to a pipe network or not. And the price that you end up paying is phenomenally high. So there's a study done by WRI a couple of years ago, which looked at Mumbai and I think at Bangalore, where I think in the case of Bangalore, they said if you're beyond the pipe, you're paying 12x. And I think in the case of Mumbai, it was 30x or something. So if you're beyond the pipe network of government, that's how much you pay, 30 times more to access drinking water. We also need to get this issue of pricing right between right to water and the value of water. Because the reality is that if you don't value water, you're not going to be able to treat it well. Quickly on groundwater, the fact that we have very poor information, mapping, information, monitoring. And cities also, I don't think, like we talked about rural areas, there is no awareness about the importance and our dependence on groundwater. And I don't see how we're going to be able to address this on scale without changing some of these behaviors. I worry about how they're arriving at calculations of quantum of wastewater. Because in trying to calculate amount of wastewater to be treated, if you don't know how much groundwater is actually being produced by individual households, how are you arriving at your wastewater to be treated? If you have no way of knowing, if there are 50,000 tube wells in the city, and you don't know how much water that they're actually being pumped out, how are you arriving at a quantum of waste to be treated at a city level? Because you've not taken that groundwater into your equation at all. So then you're always going to end up with the inability to treat wastewater. There's a lot of work that's happening now on urban water bodies, Bangalore, Chennai, Coimbatore, wetlands in Kolkata. But I think that there's now time to try and put some of these learnings together to arrive at what are sort of common constraints, what are the legal administrative challenges in all of these areas, what has worked, and then to try and expand it. Because now what's happening is every city, citizen groups are trying to deal with this on their own. But if you want to scale this up, we need to take stock of what people have learned. Last is on rainwater harvesting, how to make this widespread and aspirational, where it just doesn't seem to happen. How do we make water quality everybody's business, generate demand for ease of testing, and to focus on integrated water sanitation plans for smaller towns, 25,000 to 100,000 population. I think this thing of looking at sanitation independently, looking at water independently, I think is a thing of the past. We've got to look at these together, and we could be able to solve for these problems in smaller towns, because in large cities, we have reached limits to what we can do. So while we continue to struggle there, I think we have an opportunity in smaller towns, 25,000, 100,000 population, where you can still change what's happening before it gets too late. Yeah. And I think Dipender has talked about this whole question of challenge of sewer networks versus STPs, whether you should be looking at FSTPs and STPs and co-treatment. Municipalities are struggling with this. They've got into this belief that the solution is going to be FSTPs. And they don't know what to do with their grey water. And so there's this battle now that's taking place where there's confusion in decision makers about what's going to be the future. Should they be looking at FSTPs? And some core areas will have STPs and forget the rest. But I think there's a need to do some work and engagement on this. I'll stop here. I've probably exceeded my time. Thank you.